Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting for people to come in. We'll give them another couple of minutes here. And this is, of course, being recorded and live streamed on YouTube, so we are live. I'm not sure why there's a playback right now. Testing, playback. Okay, I think that's better. That was weird. That happens sometimes. Oh no, it's coming again. Shoot. Okay, I think that's better. That was weird. That happens sometimes. Oh no, it's coming. It's still doing. Oh, I'm gonna mute myself. Everyone hear me? Okay, I'm testing out. I think it was because I had my, oh, I know why. It was because I had my, okay, that's why. Better. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so we're waiting for the magic number, so just hang tight. A reminder to the participants, many of you have just the first initial of your last name. So if everyone else could do that, I'll send a reminder in the chat. I will rename myself. Okay, I think we're just waiting for a few more people. And then I believe it's team 3, Ryan, Edward, and Ananya who are introducing. Are you guys ready? Just can you give me a verbal?
Oh, I don't think Edward's here yet, but
okay.
I think you're right. Let me pull up.
Okay, wonderful. Hello. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? We are live on YouTube. So let me just turn it over to the participants who are going to introduce Dr. Emlen, and then Dr. Emlen will pick it up from there. All right, so team 3, do you want to go ahead?
All right, so I'll be reading out first. Originating from a family of Quakers, Dr. Doug Emlen would never seem like one to have an extensive interest in researching weaponry. From studying convergent evolution concerning morphological development in weapon animals, to whether the insulin receptor pathway alters armament size in response to a creature's nutritional environment, Dr. Emlen has sought to elucidate the evolution of seemingly excessive male animal weaponry for both the scientific community and the public.
In fact, Dr. Emlen has recently published Beetle Battles, One Scientist's Journey of Adventure and Discovery, a nonfiction book for young adults. He has even been featured on BBC's Nature's Wildest Weapons and Nova's Extreme Animal Weapons as a key scientist and reference. These diverse interdisciplinary efforts are no stranger to Dr. Emlen, who utilizes behavioral ecology, genetics, phylogenetics, and developmental biology to bolster his research efforts.
After earning his Bachelor's of Arts from Cornell University and his PhD from Princeton University, Dr. Emlen has merited quite a few accolades, including being elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to being named the Regents Professor, the highest faculty rank in the Montana University system. In 2002, Dr. Emlen achieved the Selective and Vetted Presidential Early Career Award from the Executive Office of the President. Publishing numerous renowned papers in his line of work and findings has earned Dr. Emlen significant report in the scientific community. Now we're excited to introduce Dr. Emlen with his talk titled Extreme Weapons, Natural History.
Thank you. That was really cool. So I want to say a couple things out of the gates right away. I'm going to have some fun with this. I'm going to give you a talk that's a little bit wild and a little bit crazy, and I'm going to try to push you out of your comfort zone a little bit. I mean, it's my goal to shock you and surprise you a tiny bit. That's kind of what I want to do, but you can push back just as hard. I would love to know what you think. I'd like to know what you like, what you don't like, any and all of it. And I'll be happy to take feedback of any kind. I get criticism all the time. I'm very used to it. So please have fun with this and feel totally free to share your thoughts and let me know what you think. I have spent a lot of the past year trying to figure out how to effectively teach during a pandemic. I know that you all have been on the receiving end of that too. It's a year that sort of broke a lot of records. And giving a lecture live on Zoom pretty much sucks. I'm sure you already know this. I know this. It's not an easy way to deliver material. In a perfect world, I'd be out there in person. That couldn't happen. So what I've tried to do is the next best thing. And I just wanted to explain it ahead of time. Instead of trying to balance my notes and give a talk live where you can't see me and all you see are the PowerPoints and I'm sort of the voice from behind, I went to a studio and I pre-recorded this talk on a much higher quality setup and then assembled my part of it with all the slides and the material so that I'm in front of it talking and the visuals are behind me. It's a much higher resolution, much more dynamic and engaging way to deliver the content. I'll still be here. I'm going to mute my camera. I'll be on the background. That means I have to sit here and watch myself talk, which is a little bit bizarre, but I'll be here and I can run the chat. So if you have questions or thoughts, I'm here real time. So fire away. I can deal with questions. We can talk about stuff as we go. And of course, I'll be here for as long as you want after this is done too. So that's my goal, is to sort of open that up. And then at the end, I'll mention that I'm at the University of Montana. We absolutely love it out here. And depending on the majors and the interests that all of you have, if any of you want to learn more, it's the #1 wildlife biology program in the world, and it's a top 10 biology program. Anything connected to climate, environment, this is the place. So if those issues resonate with you, talk to me later. Anyway, can I go ahead and start to share my screen and start this? Are we ready? Anybody have any questions beforehand?
We're ready.
All right, let's do it. Thank you. So as you just heard, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I study the development and evolution of animal weapons. Specifically, in my case, this means the horns of beetles. And over the years, my students and my colleagues and I have used a variety of different approaches to study these weapons. So for example, we've used biomechanics and engineering approaches to look at how beetle horns function as tools that lift or pry or twist an opponent off the side of a tree. And we've used genomic and developmental genetic approaches to study how these weapons grow. So to try to look at the genes and the developmental pathways that build a horn and control how large that horn grows to be. And we use population genetics to reconstruct how these weapons have evolved, so changed in size or shape over time. So both from population to population and from species to species. We even spend long nights out in the rain watching these beetles, and honestly by we, I mean my graduate students, to see how these beetles fight, to see how they're using the horns, and to measure the strength of selection acting on these horns in natural populations. And our latest twist, incidentally, is that we've discovered that females are much more choosy than we would think for a species with huge weapons like this. And even after battling to hold on to a territory on the side of a tree, these males still have to turn around and court the females who approach, including a variety of types of song, so 3 different types of stridulatory song, and trembling dances, and we think a complex blend of smells made up of cuticular hydrocarbons. Right now, We have soundproof boxes set up in the lab, and we're trying to record these courtship sequences so we can begin to tease apart what kind of information is contained in these signals and what specifically the females are preferring. But I'm not going to talk to you about any of that today. I mention it sort of fast and up front so that you know where I come from. Instead, I want to share a wild set of ideas with you that I think are even more exciting and certainly more important. A few years ago, I had a chance to step back from the beetles, to pore through the literature on all sorts of animal extremes. Crab claws, walrus tusks, fly antlers, elk antlers, the works. The weapons in all of these species are so outlandish in proportion that they look like they shouldn't be possible. The animals that wield these things look like they should tip over or trip or collapse under the bulk and the weight of these weapons. Well, I compiled everything I could on all of these crazy and wonderful weapon extremes to ask basic questions like, how did their weapons get to be so big? And is there such a thing as too big? I also scoured the literature on another type of weapon extreme, our own. For as you all know, we humans make weapons too. Manufactured weapons aren't parts of our bodies like tusks or horns, and instructions for their construction aren't encoded in DNA. But their forms change over time in much the same way as animal weapons, and the directions of this evolution are molded by similar forces of selection. Successful models are copied and spread, while less successful ones gradually disappear, so that populations, if you will, of manufactured weapons transform through time. And when the conditions are just right, these weapons can get taken to extremes too, surging forward to bigger and bigger sizes, deadlier, faster, and vastly more expensive. So I laid side by side the literatures on animal and military weapons to look at how and why weapons get big. And wow, am I glad that I did this, because the parallels that I found literally rocked my world, utterly transforming the way that I looked at extreme weapons, changing in many ways how I looked at my own system, the beetles, and even to a startling degree, changing how I looked at the political realities of the world around us, things like terrorism and weapons of mass destruction and national security. Extreme weapons, I'm going to suggest to you, are extreme weapons. Animal, human, it does not matter because their stories are exactly the same. Well, with the time that I have today, I want to show you what I mean by highlighting 3 of these parallels between animal and military weapons. And the first of these begins with a problem. It's a big problem. I mean, arguably, it is the overarching question for all of these animal weapon systems, at least. Why do only some species have big weapons? I mean, the quick answer is simply that weapons in these particular species got caught up in an arms race. So swept into a cycle where bigger was better, a lot better, so that weapon sizes ratcheted up fast, culminating in species where animals wield these extraordinary structures. But that just reframes the question. Why did arms races get triggered in these species and not in so many others? This may look like a lot of species, but I assure you it is not. Considered against the backdrop of the diversity of life, it's a pittance. It's a drop in the bucket. It's less than 0.1% of described animal species. So what's so special about these particular species? How can we explain why they have such huge weapons when so many other species, even closely related, otherwise biologically similar species, do not? So is there a generalizable set of conditions that precipitate arms races in animals? And can an appreciation of these conditions help us explain this sort of big picture pattern of morphological diversity? Well, it was clear right away that 2 of the central tenets of animal behavior held sway here. And together, they helped explain a lot of this diversity. So first, there was no question that the biggest animal weapons were all the product of sexual selection. So one quick aside here, there is one other ecological context that also sometimes leads to the evolution of huge weapons. A specialized style of hunting, ambush predation, can also drive the evolution of giant claspers or jaws in some predators. And I can talk more about this other context if you like after the talk. But most of the time, extreme weapons evolve in the context of sexual selection. Intense competition among males for access to females was a driver of weapon evolution in the overwhelming majority of these species. I can explain the logic of sexual selection, including why it is almost always males battling with rival males and not the other way around, after the talk if you like. Suffice this to say that the backdrop for all of these weapons was males battling with rival males over access to females. Intense competition was, in a sense, the first critical ingredient for these animal arms races. The second key ingredient, also a fundamental tenet of animal behavior, concerns the economic defensibility of critical or limiting resources. You're all almost certainly familiar with the military equivalent of this. Some locations, by virtue of their restricted access, are more readily defended than others. So surrounding things with high walls that open to the outside only through sort of sturdy gatehouses or narrow restricted tunnels that serve as choke points, this can make them much more cost-effective to defend, acting as force multipliers. And you're probably just as familiar with the cybersecurity equivalent of this, where firewalls restrict access to a small number of heavily protected gateways or tunnels. And I love this artist's rendition of a VPN tunnel, by the way. Well, this logic applies to animals too. And all else being equal, resources that are clumped or otherwise restricted access, so resources that have smaller attack surfaces, are more likely to be cost-effective to defend than are resources that are more uniformly distributed across the landscape. This is the essence of resource defense mating systems in animals, and together with intense competition, these two ecological principles go a long way towards explaining why some species have big weapons and why so many others do not. I love these ideas. They're not wrong. They're in all the textbooks. I've been teaching them in my classes for 20 years. The problem is they're not enough. There's still a piece missing. There has to be, because lots of species have intense competition and limiting or localized resources, but they don't have big weapons. I'd see this all the time when I worked with dung beetles. I could be in a Panamanian rainforest looking for howler monkey dung, or in a pasture in North Carolina, or in Yucca, Australia, or looking at elephant dung. It didn't matter, because in all of these environments and all of these places I would find side by side species with and species without big horns. Ecologically, these are very similar species. Same habitats, same seasons, even sometimes literally the same piles of dung. But only about half of these species invested in big weapons. Well, they all face intense battles for access to females, and they all guarded localized or limiting resources, either females located inside tunnels or little balls of dung. But only the species that fought inside tunnels ever had the horns. I used to explain this by pointing out that tunnels restrict access to key resources, making them cost-effective to defend, exactly as theory predicted. But honestly, little balls of dung with females clinging to them, those are pretty localized and defensible too. So what else was different? Well, this question haunted me for years, since the pattern was so striking, yet their overall ecologies and life histories were otherwise so similar. Eventually, I started looking at the details of the fights themselves, and I started looking across more and more species and more types of weapon systems. Clearly, some fights are won by traits other than big weapons. So swirling acrobatic mid-air snarls, for example, of birds and butterflies and wasps spring to mind, where stamina and agility are likely to matter most, and where clunky, costly weapons would only slow you down. But there was one more key ingredient, something that I'd never thought of. Something that, as far as I can tell, nobody in animal behavior or biology had ever thought of. Duels. It turns out that the fights must play out as one-on-one duels rather than multiplayer scrambles. The epiphany for me came from the military literature. As I've already alluded, there's a rich and vast literature out there on technological innovations and the evolution of manufactured weapons. And some very smart historians have thought a great deal about when and why arms races occur. And they've done it without any biology at all, evolution, animal behavior, or otherwise. So they bring a fresh perspective to these topics. And in this case, the missing piece to the puzzle came from the writings of a rather eclectic aeronautical and automotive engineer, who around the time of the First World War set out to model battles of attrition. I don't have time to go into the details of his models, but the essence of his logic was this. If opponents can concentrate their fire, so if they can attack all at the same time, then given a choice between spending more of your resources on bigger or better weapons or additional training for your existing troops on the one hand, or simply adding more troops on the other hand, it always pays to add more soldiers. Do not invest in expensive weapons and instead just get more soldiers. Well, Lanchester's laws are thought to have launched the soon thriving industry of operations research. And one of the lasting legacies of his work is the maxim of never divide your forces on the field of battle. But it was the other half of Lanchester's logic that got me excited. Turning his logic around, his models suggested that when soldiers do not concentrate their fire, when they line up toe-to-toe and they confront each other one-on-one, then it often does pay to invest in bigger or better weapons. Because when the fights play out as duels, the better fighter wins. It's no accident that for 5,000 years of recorded human history, in just about every culture, the only type of fight that has ever mattered for honor or status was the duel. Ritualized, repeatable, and fair. When rivals face each other in battle one-on-one in contests of strength, the better fighter wins. And this often means the contestants with the biggest, the best, or the most expensive weapons. Duels, military history suggested, could create situations where bigger weapons performed better than smaller ones. Duels could precipitate an arms race. Well, what about in animals? Well, this is the fun part because I now think that duels matter for animal battles too. Fights that play out as duels are predictable, often escalating into protracted, even ritualized contests of strength, where the bigger or the stronger male, the male with the biggest weapons, is likely to win. Contrast this with scrambles, where lots of rival males all tumble simultaneously into the fray. The outcomes of multi-attacker scrambles are far less predictable. In fact, they're often wildly chaotic. In scrambles, the better fighter might not win, and costly big weapons are far less likely to be worth their price. So I now suspect that duels are the final piece to the puzzle, the third critical ingredient for precipitating animal arms races. And for the next few minutes, I want to take this idea for a spin. Because it turns out there's some very predictable ecological situations, sort of backdrops for the battle, if you will, that by their nature cause animal contests to play out as duels. And these situations, I suspect, act like cauldrons, facilitating the rapid evolution of big weapons. And the first of these is tunnels. Sure, tunnels restrict access to a resource, making it economically defensible. But they also align male contestants so that they necessarily confront each other face to face and one-on-one. 10 rivals can't attack all at once because only one of them can fit into the tunnel at a time. I've already told you that for the dung beetles, the biggest difference between the species with and the species without weapons was tunnels. Ball-rolling species, which I'll note fight above ground in the open in mad scrambles that often involve multiplayer attackers, ball-rolling species never ever have big weapons. Tunnelers, who fight face-to-face inside these tunnels underground, very often do. In fact, lots of species with big weapons fight over tunnels. Shrimp and crabs fight over burrows, and very often these species have huge weapons. Fiddler crabs are a great example of this. Wasps with long tusks big-headed, big-mandibled bees, tusked wettas, even fanged frogs. All of these species fight inside burrows or tunnels. There was even a giant horned rodent, now extinct, that lived in Montana that appears to have fought over burrows. In species after species, the constricted space of a tunnel aligned male contests so that they necessarily occurred as duels. And that final ingredient appears to have triggered an arms race. Branches work the same way, incidentally. I mean, in a sense, they're just inverse tunnels, since a branch, like a tunnel, is a linear substrate that can be blocked and along which a rival must pass. I always like to picture Indiana Jones or Gandalf guarding a bridge. It's exactly the same idea here. Well, many species of rhinoceros beetles fight over branches, as do leaf-footed bugs. Even horned chameleons fight over branches. There he goes. And all of these species have huge weapons. Stalk-eyed flies illustrate this particularly well. These amazing flies live in the old world tropics, and they roost at night on these sort of dangling rootlets that hang down like threads from the undersides of tree trunks in these small tropical streams. Males fight to guard these hanging threads, if you will, and females collect on these roosts each night and mate with the male on that thread before they leave the next morning. So males battle over possession of these hanging threads, and just as in tunnels, the linear substrate of these threads aligns male contests so that they necessarily play out face to face as a successive series of duels. And the fights are predictable, and selection favors males with the biggest eye stalks, leading in some cases to these ridiculous extremes. And where there are species that break these rules, so there are 5 species of stalk-eyed fly that, for example, no longer roost on these hanging rootlets. The prerequisites fall apart, and all of these species have since lost their exaggerated or their extreme eye stalks. And there are many species that fight over resources that are very localized, so small in a sense that a male can literally stand over the resource to guard, swiveling as you would to face an opponent that approaches. I like to think of this like an ice fisherman fighting to hold on to the hole that he's drilled into the ice. These species don't have tunnels or branches to force an alignment of the contestants. But because males sort of stand over the resource, and because they can swivel to face each opponent as they arrive, these fights also very often play out as a succession of duels, with rivals challenging each other face to face and one-on-one. Many of these species also have huge weapons. The species of rhinoceros beetle that we studied does this. So for example, females collect to feed on wounds on the side of the tree that ooze sap, and males have to battle with each other to be able to stand guard, to stand over that resource and mate with the females when they arrive. And this video was made by one of my graduate students, incidentally. The antlered flies do this. So they stand guard over tiny holes that have been drilled into the bark of a fallen log or a fallen tree. Females need these holes in order to lay their eggs, and males that are able to hold their position, to stand their ground over these holes, are able to mate with the females when they come through. Stag beetles fight to guard wounds, so like the rhino beetles, sap oozes on the sides of trees where the females visit to feed, and males battle with rivals to hold on to those territories, and the biggest males with the largest weapons win. And here too, as soon as one of these preconditions breaks down, so there's one species of stag beetle where the females no longer collect at these sap oozes, as soon as one of these preconditions breaks down, they lose the extreme weapons. And one of the most extraordinary of all animals, the harlequin beetles, with literally a 16-inch reach from the tip of one foreleg to the tip of the other. They use their gangly legs to grapple face to face over wounds on the sides of fallen fig trees. And here again, males face each other one-on-one in a succession of duels. Finally, there are lots of species that fight out in the open that still end up confronting each other in duels. Here, I think it's the nature of the fight itself that results in the duel. Males in these species use their weapons as signals, as deterrents, sizing each other up and only escalating the contests in stages. These fights ratchet up the danger in steps escalating all the way only when rival males are very evenly matched. Fights like this don't happen by accident or by surprise. They escalate slowly and predictably, and by the time they get dangerous, they are always one-on-one. So even out in the open, their fights fulfill that last crucial prerequisite of unfolding in duels rather than scrambles. So what I'm proposing here is that we now have a generalizable explanation for when, where, and why particular species evolve extreme weapons. When species meet these conditions, selection very often favors the males with the biggest weapons, sort of pushing their evolution to the extreme. The missing ingredient for explaining animal arms races was duels. Simple changes in behavior. So fighting inside tunnels, for example, or on branches instead of out in the open, caused males to begin to confront each other one-on-one in contests of strength rather than in scrambles. And this simple change in behavior precipitated an arms race, triggering explosive evolution of bigger and bigger and bigger weapons. Well, we see exactly the same thing when we look to our own military past. This shouldn't surprise you. I mean, after all, that's where the idea came from. In these cases, it is usually a change in technology that alters the way that opponents interact, causing them to confront each other one-on-one in duels rather than in scrambles. And in case after case, this simple change in behavior from a scramble to a duel tipped the balance of selection, sparking an arms race. And I'll show you what I mean with a few examples. For almost 1,000 years, oared galleys shuttled troops from place to place in the ancient Mediterranean, with almost no change at all in ship design or ship size. Then, someone invented the battering ram, a cast bronze protrusion jutting from the front of the boat. This simple change in technology changed everything. Boats stopped being vessels of transport and started being units, weapons in and of themselves. Ships could strike other ships and sink them if they were fast enough. So ships started to line up against rival ships in one-on-one engagements or duels. And that simple switch in behavior precipitated an arms race. For the faster ship had the advantage, and faster in that age meant more rowers. So ships started getting longer and longer and longer until their hulls started to buckle. So they started stacking rowers on top of each other, and one row of oars became two, and then two rows of oars became three. Soon shipbuilders were adding 2 or 3 men to each of the oars, so 3s became 4s, and then 5s. Soon there were 8s, and then 9s, 11s, 13s. Ships got bigger and bigger and bigger until the race climaxed with a monstrosity called Ptolemy's 40. After 1,000 years of stasis, one simple change in technology aligned ship interactions so that scrambles became duels. And from that point forward, the race was on. In just 300 years, warships surged from pentaconters oared by 50 men to massive double-hulled behemoths powered by 4,000. Flash forward another 2,000 years, give or take, and we see the whole thing happen again. By this point, ships had bigger hulls, and all power was by sail. Sailing ships didn't make very good battleships. They didn't ram very well. They tried, but the rigging would get all tangled up, and it's not very easy to back up with a sailing ship. Attempts to mount cannon on the decks of these ships failed because that much weight up high made these ships tippy and unstable in rough seas. But the invention of the closable gun ports changed the rules of engagement. Now cannon could be moved lower, down close to the waterline, where their weight actually made the ships more stable. And you could pack a lot of them in along the length of each side. But these guns were not accurate, and on rolling ships in open seas, they were only effective at very close range. So ships had to line up side by side with another ship in order to fire their broadside. Voila! One-on-one engagements, duels. And from that point forward, bigger was better. Bigger ships could pack more cannon, and bigger cannon, they could unleash the bigger broadside. So one row of cannon became 2, 2 rows of cannon became 3, 6-pounders gave way to 7-pounders, then 8-pounders, 22-pounders, 30-pounders, more cannon, bigger cannon, the race was on. Here too, the critical trigger of the arms race was a change in behavior, a new technology that forced battles to be fought at close range and one-on-one, so the nautical equivalent of a tunnel or a branch. And from that point forward, bigger became better, and selection pushed these ships to the extreme. Well, when you stop to think about it, this simple prerequisite applies to lots of history's greatest arms races. One-on-one fights, both in battle and especially in tournaments, sparked explosive evolution of arms and armor in medieval knights. And one-on-one dogfights among the very first military aircraft sparked an arms race in fighter design in planes. Again and again and again, the same prerequisites trigger the arms race. Okay, so the first big parallel is duels. A certain type of fight, one-on-one encounters, helps precipitate arms races in both animal and military weapons. Well, it turns out that once started, both animal and military arms races unfold in the same way. So they proceed through the same sequence of stages, if you will. And one of these stages is deterrence. As these weapons get big, they begin to function as signals in addition to actual tools of battle. Only the best conditioned males, the absolute top of the lot, with the largest body sizes, the best immune systems, the most stored nutrients and energy resources, only the best of the best can produce the really, really big weapons. And that means that weapon size becomes a pretty good indicator, a billboard, if you will, of the fighting ability of a male. And rivals start to use weapon size to decide whether or not to escalate a fight. They don't just lunge into battle, they assess each other beforehand. Whose weapon is bigger? Because weapons are honest signals of fighting ability, it often pays the smaller male to walk away. Weapons start to act as deterrents, settling contests without dangerous battle. And in fact, in species with the biggest weapons of all, the vast majority of contests get settled this way. One study of caribou, for example, watched more than 11,000 male contests. Only 6 escalated all the way to full battle. 6 out of 11,000. Caribou have the largest weapons relative to their body size of any living vertebrate, and more than 99% of their contests are being settled without a fight. This leads to an odd paradox, that the species with the biggest weapons are often the most peaceful. I mean, make no mistake, they can and they definitely do fight. But full-on fights tend to be relatively rare, and the net effect on these populations is peace. Well, we use big weapons as deterrents too. During the heyday of the British Empire, for example, first-rate ships of the line were absolutely state-of-the-art weapons, and they made splendid deterrents. Simply sailing one of these ships into troubled waters could settle disputes on the spot. The wooden hull of one of these ships required 8,000 oak trees that were 100 years old each. And for European nations that were largely deforested already, that cost was prohibitive. Most nations had none of these ships at all, and Britain had dozens and dozens in her fleet. And this period was called, incidentally, the Pax Britannica, or the British Peace. Well, the United States uses its most expensive ships the same way today. A Nimitz-class carrier and its associated strike group costs more than $20 billion. The United States has 11 of these carrier strike groups. No other nation has even one. China's working on their first, but at the moment, no other nation has even one. Massive, powerful, prohibitively expensive, our carriers function both as weapons and as deterrents. Portable projections of military power shuttled like chess pieces to stabilize troubled regions or to implement foreign policy. And I'm telling you that these weapons at their core are no different than these. Extreme weapons are extreme weapons, and their biology really is the same. I also have to point out that all of this logic applies at the level of political landscapes and nation states too. So the Cold War, for example, the most terrifying arms race of all time, was at its core a duel, as the world stage coalesced around two opposing superpowers. And deterrence played a big part in that arms race too. In fact, it may even be the reason that we're still here. Okay, now for the last and arguably the best parallel here. So you're stuck in an arms race, and weapons are surging forward, evolving to bigger and bigger and bigger sizes, more elaborate, more extravagant, and much more expensive. Well, we've just seen that this makes them great deterrents. Billboards honestly advertising the fighting ability of an opponent. They work as deterrents because only the best of the best, the richest nations or the biggest and healthiest bulls and bucks, only the wealthy can afford to pay these extraordinary costs. So what does everybody else do? Suppose you're not the biggest male on the block. You're smaller and weaker. Life didn't shine on you the way it did on them. What do you do if you can't afford the biggest and the best weapons? The answer is you cheat. It turns out that cheating is rampant, and once you start to look for it, you find it everywhere. So take dung beetles, for example. The biggest and the best males, these are the males that have the long horns. They win the fights, and they guard the entrances to the tunnels containing the females. Well, not all males are big. In fact, most of them are pretty tiny. And tiny males don't play by the rules. So for one thing, they ditch the big weapons. Horns are expensive, and they're not going to help you anyway if you're small. So these males are hornless, and they actually look and act a lot like females. And they sneak into tunnels on the sly. Instead of fighting a losing battle at the entrance, they dig their own tunnel, a side tunnel, and in this way they can slip into a guarded tunnel beneath the guarding male. And when they do, they go straight down the tunnel, find the female, mate with the female, and turn around and leave. They can be in and out of these tunnels in less than 10 minutes flat. So as you no doubt know, sneakers like this lurk in all kinds of animal populations. So just to give you a couple of my favorites, sneaky small cuttlefish cloak themselves in colors that look like females, and they can sidle right up to a courting male, literally slipping in between the male and the female he's courting. Sneaky male salmon zip into a territory, raining sperm down in a cloud over a female's eggs, in and out of the territory so fast that the guarding male can't stop him. And sneaky bighorn sheep, called coursers, race into a big bull's territory and attempt to mate with females on the sly while he's distracted in the middle of a battle. In species after species after species, males who can't afford to play by the rules break the rules and cheat. Well, cheaters affect the whole dynamic of the arms race because they steal reproductive success from the big weaponed males. Those males still pay the full price of building and using their weapons, so the cost to them stays the same. But now the payoffs, the benefits that they glean from having those weapons get smaller. Eggs that are fertilized by sneaker males aren't fertilized by the guarding males. He produces the horns, he fights to guard the tunnel, but the offspring of that tunnel gets sired by another male. Well, as long as these sneaky males steal only a little bit, not much changes. The benefits of big weapons stay huge and the arms races surge forward. But when cheaters start doing too well, then they can collapse an arms race. I mean, suddenly it's not worth it anymore to produce the really big weapons. Males without the big weapons start doing better than the males with them. And we expect these big weapons to quickly disappear. Well, cheaters erode the success of our biggest weapons too, and they've done so for thousands of years. Asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics are the classic cheat. If you don't have the resources to face an invading force head on in conventional battle, then don't. Guerrilla tactics are exactly like sneaky male fish and beetles. They never wear military uniforms. Instead, they hide, blending in with civilians in much the same way that sneaky males look and act like females. And they use makeshift, inexpensive weapons like Molotov cocktails, pipe bombs, and IEDs. Here too, as with animals, as long as they don't inflict that much damage, nothing changes. State-of-the-art weapons continue to be well worth their price. But when a cheating tactic starts doing too well, then overnight it can collapse an arms race. And over throughout history, technologies that cheated have collapsed an arms race. Often, these involve a new type of weapon. Always, they involve a tactic that's cheap. They win by not paying the price of these huge weapons and by rendering those expensive weapons obsolete. English longbows and gunpowder, for example, spelled the end for medieval armor. Once plate armor could be pierced, then suddenly it wasn't such a great idea to ride into battle sitting astride a horse like a big, shiny, bulky target. And overnight, armor went from being a fantastic form of protection to an expensive, heavy, bulky liability. Well, so too. Exploding shells shattered the arms race of sailing warships, and submarines caused ironclad battleships to be obsolete. In every case, and there are dozens, new strategies that broke the rules of engagement caused our most expensive weapons to suddenly be obsolete. Hugely expensive, but no longer worth the price. Well, as I close, I have to flash forward to the present day and to leave you with a sobering thought, because I'm starting to suspect that we may be dangerously close to such a situation right now. As you all know, the US today stands alone as the sole superpower, and our weapons are both exorbitantly expensive and magnificent. We have the most advanced weapons in the world, and we are almost certainly safer because of it. Our newest technologies have incredible potential both as weapons and as deterrents. The Gerald Ford class aircraft carriers, brand new at just $13 billion apiece. And the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, an aircraft that cost $400 billion to design and build. These are great examples. But all of these weapons depend critically on software. Steering and navigation of our submarines and aircraft carriers, guidance of our missile systems, and also the sensor nets that we deploy to detect incoming missiles, command and control, safeguards on our nuclear weapons. All of these are controlled by computers and software. A pilot can't even fly a modern fighter without this software. Fly-by-wire systems, as they're called, are critical for handling these planes and for making sure that the pilots don't black out from the G-forces. And all of these systems are vulnerable to hackers. Cyber hackers are the ultimate sneaks, surreptitiously worming into our control systems. I used to think that the danger of cyber hackers was a stolen credit card number or identity theft. And oh my gosh, did my worldview change when I started researching all of this. So as you may or may not know, the United States has already been hacked several times. In 2004, the Chinese broke into a suite of our state-of-the-art weapons systems in an event called Titan Rain. And in 2013, we caught them at it again. This time, they'd compromised the Terminal High Altitude Missiles Defense System, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the F-22 Raptor, our MV-22 Osprey, as well as 37 other weapon systems, including our drones. And the scariest part about all of this? They weren't simply stealing secrets, they were inserting code. Designed to hide there, to lurk undetected. These scripts, had they not been detected, would have given the Chinese complete control over our weapon systems. By activating these hidden programs, they could have turned our most expensive weapons against us, raising the alarming question of whether our weapons too might soon be obsolete, like medieval armor and battleships before them, simply no longer worth the price. The silver lining, if you want to call it that, is that the United States military is well aware of this threat to our national security. And I had a chance to hear General Michael Hayden, former director of both the NSA and the CIA, talk at a conference on cybersecurity in Washington, D.C. in 2016. He considers cyber hacking to be threat number one. And he considers cyberspace, or the internet, to be the fourth theater of war. So land, sea, air, and now cyberspace. And he says that they know that the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, as well as probably the Iranians, have buildings full of hackers working 24/7 to break into our systems. This is the new arms race, in a sense, since he admits that we have just as many on our side hacking back. And at least according to him, our hackers are better than their hackers, at least for now. I got to present at that conference too, right after General Hayden. If you can imagine me standing in front of that crowd talking about animal arms races and sneaky male dung beetles to the chief technical officers of the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Defense, NSA, as well as Microsoft, Google, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin. Talk about a fish out of water. And to show you just how strange and exciting life can be, and how far crazy ideas like this can take you, I recently got to witness these state-of-the-art technologies firsthand. The Navy was kind enough to fly me out to the USS Carl Vinson, so CVN 70, and head of our Carrier Strike Group 1, while it was at sea in the Pacific conducting operations. That meant that we had to fly out to the carrier in these transport planes and slam down on the deck and catch the tripwire, so go for an arrested landing from 150 miles an hour to 0 in like 100 yards. And we got to observe the inner workings of an aircraft carrier at sea. From the bridge to the bowels of the ship, we got to stand on the flight deck as F-18 Super Hornets and brand new F-35 strike fighters came screaming in for landing, slamming down on the deck and yanking to a stop literally 20 feet from where we stood. I mean, I took this picture with my cell phone to give you a sense of how close we were. And I got to look at the new F-35 fighters firsthand. The helmet alone on these things cost $500,000 each. And most importantly, I got to talk to the crew. From the cooks to the mechanics, the pilots, the first officer, and the captain. And I asked all of them about the threat of cyber hacking. Guess what? It's threat number one. This is what they worry about all the time. It literally keeps them awake at night. So I confess, this has been quite a journey for me, a ride more wild than I ever could have imagined. I'm a biologist after all. I study beetles, not battleships. And I used to be nervous about writing and speaking about these parallels with the military. I titled my book Animal Weapons, honestly because I was scared to go all in with the military implications. I'm not scared now. I've talked to admirals and generals, foot soldiers, sailors, historians, and the chief technical officers of the Department of Defense, the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA. These parallels are real. And I love the idea that basic muddy boots research can extend so far. I mean, who'd have thought that poking around in the mud in a rainforest, studying dung beetles, could ever tell us anything useful about our own military weapons or about national security? But I have to say that the more I dug, the more convinced and astonished I became that there really are parallels between animals and ourselves. And I know already that these parallels are transforming how I think about biology, guiding our research in new directions that we never could have anticipated. And my gut tells me that it's going to be just as useful the other way around. So for example, if you follow the United States National Defense Strategy, for the last several years, it has all coalesced around something called great power competition, which sure looks like we're setting ourselves up for yet another duel. And I think biology has a lot to tell us about how that's going to turn out. And I'll point out that this past fall, when everybody was glued to their televisions terrified about the outcome of the elections, and we were all focused on whether our democracy would hold together, Russia snuck in underneath and hacked all of our systems. They succeeded in a massive hack of our military technologies and our national infrastructure. So they essentially had us all focused one way, worried about tampering with the elections, and while we were looking one way, they gutted our systems. And we're still figuring out just how bad that particular hack was. So again, a timely reminder of how relevant some of these ideas are to things like national security. But for now, at least, I hope that I've convinced you that there are some exciting and surprising insights to be gleaned from the extraordinary weapons of beetles and crabs and caribou and elk. Thank you. A quick plug if you're curious. I'm back. All right.
Oh, I thought you were going to finish the plug. Was that your
No,
most
I
recent
was
book?
supposed to stop it before the plug, and I didn't catch it in time. That's my middle school reader's book. I learned a very
Oh,
important lesson. Don't publish a book right before a pandemic, because it was like dead on arrival. All the warehouses were shut down. All the people reviewing books were on hiding. It totally died. But it was a really fun effort learning how to write it. So.
Oh, well, I'm sure after everyone gets back into their normal routine, it'll have a comeback.
You optimist. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful. And I saw some folks giving a Zoom reaction. So let's all give digital reaction to Dr. Emlen for a fascinating talk. I was literally on the edge of my seat and trying to write notes and everything as well. And there were a lot of questions coming up in the chat. And I'm thinking that just for the sake of being organized and making sure we get all the questions asked, that our Q&A team, which is team 9, this is Belle, Henry, and you. I thought that they could read the questions to you, Dr. Emlen, and then you can respond. Obviously, you've read a lot of them and you've responded.
I missed a few of them, so let's do it that way. And I just want to add a caveat right up front, because this is still, I mean, I've been talking about this in various ways to different audiences for a little while now. I'm trying as a scientist at this stage in my career to spend a lot of time reaching out and trying to connect with audiences that are outside of my field and outside of academia. But I just want to add a caveat. I mean, when you talk about military technologies, it very much becomes an us versus them kind of a dynamic. That's how the US military sees it. That's how they're treating it. Part of what I do is reach out and talk to people like generals and, admirals on an aircraft carrier. But that doesn't mean that I don't see like China as the enemy. I have friends in China. I collaborate with people all over Asia. I don't mean it to come across that way. I hope I didn't offend it. I told you I want to push you out of your comfort zone, but not for that reason. I want to push you out of your comfort zone because of the ideas. But I just want to add that as a disclaimer. If any of you found this pushing into an area where it wasn't comfortable that I need to know about, let me know. You can either do it in the chat or you can email me later. I am trying to shock people. I'm trying to get people thinking, but I'm certainly not trying to, well, I hope I made that clear. I'm not trying to like push one story or one side over others. I just want to get people thinking about the issues. Okay, I'll shut up.
All right. Yes, thank you for that. How about if we have team 9 read one of the chat questions that was unanswered, and then Dr. Emlen can respond. So go for it, team 9.
Okay, sure. So yeah, our team has compiled like all the chat questions into a doc, and we know like some of them have already been answered, but we'll try to like skip over.
Well, not everybody may have been able to read the chat while the talk was going. So if you think it's worth your time, then you can ask it to me again. You can see if I'm consistent.
Sure. So I guess our first question is from Edward, and he asked, or Edward and Alvin, they asked similar questions. So they ask, since the development of extreme weapons in these beetle species seem to be nutrition dependent when developing their horns or other extreme features, are other body parts reduced in size? And does it help if the weapons are able to serve multiple purposes, like fighting and getting mates?
Yeah, great questions. And fortunately, one that I can answer, because we actually looked at that in the lab for a while. So whenever you get weapons that are that extreme, they're pretty much guaranteed to be expensive in one way or another. I mean, it takes a lot of material resources to produce something that big, and the resources have to come from somewhere. If they're produced very gradually over a long period of time, sometimes the animals can make up for it by feeding extra and sort of taking in more nutrients than they otherwise would. But for most animals in most environments, they don't have that luxury. And they're essentially burning the equivalent of discretionary resources whenever they build a structure. The beetle horns in the species we work on are 30% of the body weight of that animal. I mean, I don't know how to, I've tried over the years to think of ways to give you a parallel. That's like producing a coffee table and cementing it to the top of your head. It's a non-trivial investment, and it costs them a lot. And in these animals that we work on, they feed as a larva, they're a grub. Then they go through metamorphosis and they rebuild their body and they produce all the adult structures, and then they close out as an adult. And once they're an adult, they're done. They're essentially, they're not going to change in size. It's not like antlers where they shed them and regrow them. They're stuck. And during that window, when they're growing the horns, they're not taking in any new resources. They've purged their gut. They're in a sort of static state going through metamorphosis, and it costs them a ton. And so we found that depending on the species, it can stunt the eyes, it can stunt the wings, it can stunt the genitalia. Some of these beetles with big horns have tiny testes. And you want to talk about a reproductive price, that's a pretty hefty one. So yes, these things are so expensive that it can stunt the growth of other body parts. But it's interesting that it varies depending on the species. And mechanistically, developmentally, we tried to tackle that for a while and never came up with a very satisfactory answer for why it would stunt wings in one species and eyes or testes in another species. But I want to add one other twist here, because it's one of the fun caveats in my field of animal behavior right now. You would think that if you went out into the field and you looked at elk or you looked at beetles with a huge horn, that you'd be able to measure that cost. I mean, it's enormous. It has to be expensive, right? It's astonishing how often we go out and try to quantify the cost and don't find it. And that was a real paradox for a while. But I think what's happening is that because it's expensive, the cost acts like an agent of selection, and it favors males that are able to stumble on a way to produce that structure more cheaply, to somehow ameliorate that cost. And as soon as a male figures out how to do that, boom, those are the genotypes that are favored, because now they're producing the weapon without paying quite as much as everybody else. And that kind of a process creates a scenario where you have these enormous weapons that were really expensive early on, but because they've been there long enough, they no longer are as expensive. And you go out as a biologist and you try to measure these things and you're like, wait a minute, they're not expensive. It's like the ghost of cost past, if you will, because these things are so efficient at evolving constantly that the costs themselves sort of drive the evolution of ways to get around the cost. I hope that makes sense. I didn't want to send you off on a tangent, but we've wasted a lot of, not wasted, we've spent a lot of time trying to measure the costs and been very surprised sometimes at how hard it is to detect the cost. All right, I'll try not to get so carried away with every question or we won't get very far.
Okay, so the next question is from Ryan, and he put it in the chat already, and I think you answered, but I think it's worth it to ask it again. So how does the shape of the animal weapon differ between branches and tunnels? And does the tunnel create more of a specific shape of a weapon due to the limiting environment of a tunnel compared to an open branch?
And I gotta quick add a caveat that biology at the moment, sexual selection, the field of animal behavior that looks at extravagant structures like this, does a pretty good job explaining why things like weapons get big. It does a terrible job explaining why weapons have the particular shapes that they do. We really don't have, and like, I live in Montana, we've got mule deer and white-tailed deer, very closely related. They're using their antlers to do the same thing. The antlers are about the same size, but they have different branching patterns. And no one has a clue why one of them has one branching pattern and the other has the other. As far as we can tell, it's totally arbitrary. People have attempted to explain some of the aspects of the shape of weapons, and we've made progress in some ways, like the elk rack above my head. We're pretty confident that the brow tines, the branches that come off the base of the antler, work the same way that the hilt on a sword or whatever the crosspiece on a sword works. It blocks, it's a defensive aspect, so that when a rival antler scrapes along the antlers of a focal male, it stops in the notch and it doesn't actually strike the head of the animal. So part of the shape of the antlers, like the branching, we think acts sort of defensively to catch the antlers of an opponent and keep the battle one of pushing matches rather than stabbing. But with the beetles and the tunnels, we really were at a loss. I spent years trying to explain why one species has 5 different horns coming off different parts. One species has a horn coming on the head. One has them coming from the thorax. We did a terrible job. I looked all over the world. It's like they live in Australia. They live in outback. I mean, they live in the rainforest. I started trying to see if I could explain, are there certain types of weapons in some habitats? No, they all fight in a tunnel. And it doesn't matter if you're in a rainforest or you're in the middle of the southwestern United States, a tunnel is a tunnel. It's a tube in the ground. So all these beetles, no matter where they live, are essentially fighting in exactly the same environment. It's a dark cylindrical tube. So we have no idea why they have such a diversity of weapons. I think at this point that there is a restriction on some of the aspects of the shape. You can't have a weapon that sticks across too far, or it drags all the time and it makes it impossible for the beetles to move. So there is sort of a limit in a way to a beetle in a tunnel that doesn't apply to the beetles that fight out in the open around branches or things like that. So in a sense, quick answer, they're more constrained in tunnels than they are not in tunnels. But that's not a very satisfying answer because it doesn't explain most of the diversity. My current idea is this process I just talked about. I think arms races cycle. I think they go charging off in one direction, and then eventually the cheaters invade and the whole thing stops. They lose the weapons. But the system is still poised. The males are still competing for access to females. They're still fighting over localized resources. They're still fighting in tunnels. So the prerequisites still apply. So some other bump or knob somewhere else pops up at some point down the road, and the whole thing happens again. You get a new arms race for a different horn, and it collapses, and then a new arms race. And I think this kind of a process, iterated over thousands of dung beetle species, has given us all kinds of horns, but the actual horn shapes are probably random. Anyway, another carried away answer. I failed in my ability to do it quickly, but does that make sense? These are great questions. These are the kind of things that keep me awake at night.
Okay, sir. So for our next question, we have from Noel. Do these insects use their weapons against other species, aka animals as well, enemies as well? If so, is it in the same way that they react to the rivals of the same species? And we thought that what went along well, this one was a question Neil asked as well. It's how common are cross-species duels?
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to answer the second part first. Cross-species duels, if you're thinking of it like the battles between males, not often. But cross-species duels happen all the time in another context that you probably already are familiar with, but you're just not thinking about it that way. Parasite-host interactions very often spiral into an arms race, and that's usually between a particular host and a particular parasite. So that's a duel. It's a cross-species duel. Predator-prey dynamics, sometimes they're very diffuse because predators eat lots of kinds of prey, or insects and plants that, they eat lots of kinds of insects, but occasionally those interactions coalesce and focus around a species-species duel. That's when they explode. That's when the arms races happen. So most of the types of other kinds of antagonistic arms races that you may already be familiar with, I'll bet you if you think about it, really come down to a species versus species duel. So in that sense, the logic applies. But do the antlers of an elk get used all the time against mule deer or moose? Probably not. Those types of battles tend to be focused around access to females, and that's a within species type of a problem. Now there's another part, the first part of that question. Can they use the antlers in more than one context? Yes. If you've got a huge rack and you spend a bloody fortune producing it and it'll protect you from a wolf, hell yeah, you use the antlers to protect you from the wolf. So that makes it interesting as a biologist. You can look at these animals and they use the antlers to fight with bulls, and they use the animals to protect themselves against predators. They use the antlers to protect themselves against predators. How do we discern what the primary function is? Which of these functions was the original function that drove the evolution of the weapon, and which is sort of a secondary function? Those become very interesting problems. I have a grad student that works on giant stick insects from Papua New Guinea with huge hind legs, and very unusual for stick insects for males to be that big and to have those kinds of weapons. And that was part of his PhD, was figuring out, are they using them as an anti-predator weapon primarily, or are they using them in male battles for access to females? And so very often, most of the time, it's the battles with rivals over females that really drives the show. But then once you got them, you use them in the context of protection. So, and that's also relevant. Somebody asked me about female weapons, and I can come back. I don't want to jump the order here, but that's another really big one that a lot of people get excited thinking about. Why aren't there more species with female weapons? If you look at something like caribou, the big antlers are in the males, and that's driven by the same story I just gave you, males fighting rival males over access to females. But there's added value in having the antlers in protecting access to resources, particularly during the dead of winter in places where forage is really limiting. females will fight with rival females over the area they need for their young to feed. And it turns out that females in some caribou populations produce miniature versions of the antlers that they're using in battles over access to foraging resources for their young. So there again, the weapon is primarily in males and primarily for rivals over access to reproduction, but secondarily, females are able to turn on that set of genes and express the trait. And they're using it in this sort of secondary context of competition for access to resources that they need for the young.
Okay. So our next question is from Anushe, and we grouped Kai's together because they were similar. Okay. So they asked, what is your opinion on the saying, the pen is mightier than the sword? So basically, someone was Anushe was very curious, like if someone's brain could be their weapon. And similarly, Kai asked, do you think humans broke the mold of natural animal weapons by investing in intelligence instead of other physical weapons? And if so, do you think any other species will emerge to compete with humans at any point in the future, or even develop a better?
Okay, the second part is a doozy there. The first part I'll tackle first. Yes, absolutely. If you look not just at humans, but you look at related primates, they also have intense male aggression over access to females in a number of species. Chimpanzees, baboons are great examples. So the kinds of prerequisites that you would see in these other species apply, but rather than have huge weapons like antlers or horns, I mean, chimps have some pretty big canines, but the weapons really are intellect. And it's not just intellect in the human sense of, oh, I can design a nuclear weapon. The real intellect is social dynamics, learning how to navigate in a socially complex environment and figuring out who the cheaters are, figuring out who the collaborators are, and figuring out how to navigate that social reality so that you can garner resources effectively. And in that kind of a dynamic, facial recognition, reading cues, I mean, communication, all these kinds of things that come with the primate intellect, in particular, the human intellect, really are the weapons in a sense. Those are the types of traits that determine success or failure. And, you know, obviously in some cases that's also resulted in humans using their intellect to build manufactured weapons. But honestly, it's the intellect and the reading and playing the social environment that I think most people would agree is the key weapon of humans. And it requires a very different set of skills, very different suite of traits. So.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, somebody asked me about what species is going to rival us. I don't know. I think we're probably going to self-destruct by ourselves, not to get doom and gloom, but I think our biggest enemy is ourselves right now.
Okay, so another question from Neil is, how do invasive species affect the development of extreme weapons, both in surrounding species and the invasive species itself?
I saw that one and I punted on it during the talk. So it was Neil, right? When you're asking that question, what are you picturing for an invasive species? I think of things like knapweed or mussels that are shellfish that are invading a lot of the areas around here. But what are you picturing in your head when you picture an invasive species?
I mean, I wasn't picturing anything particular, but I guess first thing that comes to mind is beetles, I guess, just because we've been talking about them.
All right, and there's invasive things like pine borer. I mean, there are some invasive beetles too. My quick answer is that the kinds of systems I'm talking about where you get these really big weapons, the weapons are expensive. I mean, I already told you the beetles, it can be 30% of the body weight. A fiddler crab, which is the world record holder, the claw weighs as much as all the rest of the crab. So depending on how you draw that line, it either weighs 50% of the total, or actually, if you think about it, it's 100% of the weight of the male. If you cut the chela off and just weighed the rest of the crab, the weapon weighs 100% as much as the rest of that body. It's an extraordinary investment. Because there are trade-offs, and we touched on that before, you can't do everything. Individuals that put all their resources in these big weapons usually are very clunky, they're very strong, they're not mobile, they're not agile, they're not adept at dispersing. These are not the individuals that disperse effectively. And so they're often not the species that are the first colonizers of new habitats. I mean, I realize that invasive species can get carried along by us in the hold of a ship and dumped, so they don't have to necessarily be a disperser. But in general, you find that the invasive species are investing their resources in other kinds of traits than big clunky weapons. But that's an oversimplification. Things like knapweed, they produce allelopathic chemicals into the soil that can outcompete native species. And I've got some colleagues here at UM that have spent a lot of time looking at knapweed. That's the example that sprung to my mind. Knapweed in Europe, parts of Europe where it's native, it's a twinky little weed, it's a little tiny forb that doesn't really do anything. It never gets that big. It never dominates any of its local communities. And then you bring it over to someplace like Montana, and it just devastates grassland ecosystems and becomes a monoculture. So it's like, what's different? Did the genotypes that came over here, do they have super weapons that the other ones don't? No. They have novel weapons in the sense that the chemicals they produce are ones that these communities have never seen before. So those weapons can be really effective because they're new and none of the plants in the rest of the community know how to deal with it. They've never had any confrontation with it before. And so in a sense, knapweed has an edge, but it's not because it's an extra potent or deadly weapon. It's a weapon that was locally adapted to a different part of the globe. But in general, I would say invasive species aren't heavily weaponed. They're just darn good dispersers, and they're really good at surviving in new habitats.
Okay, our next question is from Alvin. He asked, is weapon size the only evolutionary strategy animals use to attain an advantage? Are strategies perhaps like behavior or counter weapons used as well?
So great question, and I hope I answered it with the talk too, because the whole idea of sneaking is an answer to that question. If you can't produce the big weapon because it's too darned expensive and you don't have the resources, don't even try. Producing a tiny little horn isn't going to help you if everybody else has these big weapons. You switch to plan B or even plan C, and you go about trying to get access to reproduction in a totally different way. And almost every animal species that's been studied to date has some kind of a sneak strategy that the males that can't effectively fight do. So everywhere around us are examples of animals using other strategies other than big weapons. And then there's lots of species that most species don't have big weapons at all, because even in those species, even with the dominant individuals, it's still not cost effective. Those things are expensive, and there's other better ways to try to secure access to reproduction. So one of the things I love about animal behavior is it is so diverse. I mean, there are species that do just about anything you can imagine. And I love trying to blow the minds of the students that come and take my behavior classes, because the things that animals do are just shocking sometimes. They're so crazy. So quick answer is no. Weapons are a relatively rare way of dealing with competition that only arise in a very particular set of ecological circumstances. And it's usually only cost effective for a fairly small subset of the males, even in the species that do produce the weapons. So that's kind of why I study it, right? I love these extremes. They're rare, they're special. So I spent my career trying to figure out what are the conditions that cause an animal to do that.
Okay. Our next question is from Janice, and she asked, in animals, does sexual selection affect such arm races by much? For example, are cheaters likely to successfully mate with females, given that they look much different from strong males with large weapons? How is the female's taste dependent upon the male weapons, if it is?
Great question. And the quick answer is everything goes. There are so many animals that you find examples of just about everything you can imagine. There are some species where the fighting is the whole story. And once the males have already battled it out, there's really no reason for a female to be picky at all. If she shows up at the feeding territory or at the harem or wherever the location is, there's no reason she should spend a lot of time and calories and risks searching around and trying to find a better male. The male that's there probably won 75 battles in order to be there. It's not an accident. He's the super stud male. She's done. And so you find in some of these species with the huge weapons, the females are really passive. Like it looks like they're not making any choices at all. But then you find other species where they're exquisitely choosy, even after that. And I want to give you an example that we're working on right now in my lab. I gave you a hint of it when I showed you the soundproof boxes. We spent years studying a rhinoceros beetle with an enormous pitchfork horn that is 30% of the body weight of these males. We thought that was the whole story. They fight. I showed you a video. They flip the rivals off the sides of the trees. The big males guard those territories. The females come in to feed. If you look as a behavior biologist and you watch them, the female just sits there. I mean, it looks exactly like one of these textbook scenarios where they're not choosing at all. They don't care. If the male wins the fights, he's the best male, end of story. But then my students in the field working in Taiwan and then working in Japan found that that's not the whole story. The females don't look like they're choosing, if we're a person applying our sense of the world on a beetle, it looks like she's just sitting there. But the females have total control over whether they accept the males. And the females are rejecting the males. Even the biggest males with the biggest weapons, the females are rejecting them. And we stumbled on the fact that even in our beetles with these huge weapons, the males are having to sing. So they fight, and then that's not enough. And so now they climb on the back of the female and they start dancing and they start singing with these different kinds of songs. And we can show that the songs differ across populations. So females are exerting exquisite preference behaviors and we don't have a clue why. If the horn is supposed to be such an honest indicator of the quality of the male, then why are they ignoring the horn? And why are the males having to sing and dance? What information are they getting from this? We don't know. But that's just another example of the fact that it's what females prefer isn't always obvious, and it's not always the same as fighting characteristics. There are a bunch of species where the traits that make a male successful in competition actually make him a really lousy father. And females prefer the males that aren't the fighters. So bluebirds are an awesome example of this. Renee Duckworth's work. There's a whole set of conditions where the dispersing aggressive males are the ones that win, moving into new territories. They outcompete the other species. They guard the territories. They're the brightest. They're the most aggressive. Females don't pick those males. They prefer the duller males that aren't aggressive because those males put a ton of effort into helping raise the young. So there's this dynamic where sometimes the aggressive bright males do the best because they're moving into new territories, but then once they're established, it's the other males that do the best because the females actually prefer the non-aggressive males. And you get this sort of cyclical pattern of success in these populations. So I know I'm getting carried away, but if you're interested in these kinds of things, animal behavior is a wonderful field rooted in evolutionary biology that really looks at all the quirky things that animals do and tries to make sense of them given sort of an evolutionary biology perspective. Wow, there's a lot of chats. I can't really see them when I'm also looking at you guys. So hopefully somebody's screening. So.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question is from Joyce. She says that she's read about a phenomenon where animals avoid violence for a while after losing a fight. Does the development of larger weapons over time correspond to any change in this effect? In other words, does evolutionary selection for better fighting ability in a population decrease the amount of time animals avoid fighting again?
Okay, so if I understand the question right, it's cool. It's getting into this winner-loser effect. And it's something that it's a cutting edge area in animal behavior. And honestly, it's something that we didn't expect to exist in things like a beetle. It's something you expect in a primate or an intellectually really slick and capable species, but we're finding that these winner-loser effects actually crop up in everything, including beetles. Mechanistically, it's interesting. I'm just going to dive into mechanism for a minute because when you guys introduced me, somebody mentioned the insulin work. We got interested in traits like weapons and what makes the weapons so sensitive. Why are they more sensitive to nutrition or stress or parasites than leg length or head height or other types of the body? There's something special about the weapons. They're more variable. They're more sensitive to extremes and to conditions, and it makes them a good signal. It's why you can look at the weapon and tell so much about that male that you can't get just looking at the size of their jaw or their ears or their legs. Weapons are special. And one of the reasons in at least a bunch of these species is that the cells that grow the weapon, that become the weapon, are much more sensitive to circulating levels of insulin than are the cells in the other parts of the body. So a starved animal has lower overall levels of circulating insulin. And that's kind of the central clearinghouse mechanism that causes everything to dial back. That's why starved animals are smaller overall than well-fed animals. It's because the cells are reading that change in insulin and they're growing more slowly in a poorly fed animal than they are in a better fed animal. So that's the sort of physiology of why nutrition affects body size. So if the weapons are extra sensitive, then changes in insulin are going to have an amplified effect on the size or the growth of the weapons. And we now know that these dominance interactions, I didn't forget the question, I'm coming back. These sort of social dynamic, if a male loses a fight, it actually reduces his insulin levels. It feeds back into these centralized circulating hormones. And in some insects, juvenile hormone is another hormone that plays in. There's a physiological consequence of getting trounced in a fight. And there's a physiological consequence of winning in a fight. And so initial asymmetries become compounded. Losers tend to continue to lose and winners tend to continue to win. And it's not a coincidence. It's both learning from learning how to fight, but also physiological feedback loops that affect the aggressiveness and the behavior of those animals after an encounter. And those can feed back and affect the weapons depending on the species. If the weapons are already done, like in a beetle, it's not going to change the weapon size. But if it's an animal like antlers where they grow them every year, yeah, losing or getting really sick, all those things can cause the antlers that animal produces in the next cycle, in the next year, to be smaller than they otherwise would have. So these social interactions are extremely important, and it just messes up everything. It makes it a lot harder to interpret the outcome of fights because there's this whole nother layer going on, but it's a fun one. And we're paying attention to it this summer with all the experiments we're doing on our beetles. This comes back to this question I had a minute ago: do females prefer the same things that the males use to win the fights? We're doing a whole bunch of courtship experiments on the beetles in my lab where we're setting up chambers and recording the males as they do their songs and dances. But I have a colleague at Gonzaga that's working on the same population, and he has a little plane and he's a pilot. So he flies back and forth and we're shuttling the beetles back and forth, and he's staging contests. So he's measuring the same signals, the dancing and the songs and the horns, to see what the males are using to size each other up when they battle. And he's looking at this winner-loser effect. He knows the history of every beetle. So he knows whether they won or lost the previous encounter, and he's looking at the effects of that on whether it influences their subsequent encounters. And because it's the same animals, at the end of the summer, we'll be able to look at the courtship signals and whether the females preferred the males and compare that to the agonistic or fighting signals and whether the males won or lost their fights. So hopefully we'll be able to answer for our species this question of whether the females are preferring the same things or different things from what relates to fighting success. So these are all fun questions. I mean, I'm biased. I know it's a far cry from biochemistry, but there's biochemistry in here too. I didn't tell you about the cuticular hydrocarbons in the waxy cuticle of these beetles. We're looking at that too.
All right, so the next question asks, do chemical weapons exist among beetles and insects, and does the same evolutionary phenomena apply to these chemical weapons, where it reaches beyond simply use for protection, but also to an extreme where it's a demonstration of health for reproductive selection?
Phenomenal question. This is awesome. I just got to add, the questions that you're throwing at me are as good or better than the ones that I gave a talk at Cambridge 2 weeks ago to an academic department of grad students, postdocs, and faculty. And I just want to say that these questions are literally as good and as fun. They're actually better than some of the questions I got at Cambridge. So good job. So, and now I forgot it. Dang it. What was that last question again? It was, can you read it?
You're muted.
Okay, so the very last question, it was basically whether these chemical weapons reach beyond like just for protective measures and for also for reproductive selection.
When I was working on the book on animal weapons, I started digging into the chemical weapons literature and then finally just set it aside. I realized I was spreading myself so thin already, trying to cover big weapons and all these different animals, and then throw in the military, which was it took me a year just reading military literature to try to get up to speed on that. I didn't even want to deal with the chemical weapons, in part because I think they play by different rules. I think the quick answer is that there are different kinds of chemical weapons. The kinds of weapons that I've been telling you about today are big and conspicuous and very expensive. And the fact that they're expensive is critical. That's kind of what sets the stage for all the rest of their biology. The fact that they work as deterrents, the fact that they're vulnerable to collapse of an arms race, all that hinges on the fact that these things are extravagant and really expensive. Some chemical weapons are also really expensive, but a lot of them aren't. So the kinds of weapons I'm talking about, the antlers behind me, that probably 1% of the bulls in an elk population can afford to produce antlers that big. Most males just can't even play the game. When you think of chemical weapons, think of something like a coral snake. Everybody produces the toxin. Males, females, it doesn't matter whether you're a big snake, small snake, well-fed snake, starved snake. It doesn't matter whether you lost the last 27 fights. everybody's toxic. So in that sense, the poisons are cheap enough that they're not something that's sorting out the resource rich individuals from the resource poor individuals. Everybody can do it. And that was the main reason I discarded it initially, thinking, well, it's not going to be a deterrent in the same way. It's not going to play by the same rules. So quick answer, chemical weapons sometimes play by a different set of rules, and they're often evolving as a defensive characteristic to protect against, predation, for example, rather than a male-male agonistic battle. There's twists, even things like rattlesnakes, some of the most venomous snakes, they are deadly with their chemical weapons, but when the males fight males, they don't go nuclear. They don't use the chemical weapons, which is a really interesting paradox that a lot of people try to figure out. If you're a male and you're throwing down and you're fighting with a rival male, I mean, everything is on the line. If you can't reproduce, you're done. Why wouldn't you go nuclear? Why wouldn't you use your chemical weapons? But they don't. So when they're fighting rivals within a species, they never use the really dangerous chemicals. They use sort of conventional weapons in that equivalent. So there again, even in some of these heavily armed, chemically protected species, it's very clear that the chemical weapons are playing by a different set of rules from the kinds of weapons I'm used to studying. But it's a whole cool thing. And honestly, aside from the fact that you also mentioned I come from a line of Quakers, I don't really want to just be the kill weapons person. But if I were to sit down and try to write another book, I would probably want to focus on chemical weapons. I think there's a lot of potential there. And if any of you took the time to read my book on animal weapons, that was from a couple of years ago, I got a little scared at the end, arguing that big weapons work like a deterrent because they're expensive, and that nuclear weapons and biological weapons today weren't playing by those rules. They're actually not that expensive. Our expensive weapons are aircraft carriers and F-35 Joint Strike Fighters and conventional weapons. The weapons of mass destruction aren't very expensive. And that means almost anybody can do it, which means you're starting to deal with the equivalent of a scramble rather than a duel. And if I'm going to use biology to look at the political stage, that's bad. That's scary, because scrambles always escalate. There's never a situation where a male backs down in a scramble. It's total chaos. Whereas in a duel, they're very predictable. That's what happened in the Cold War, is things started to heat up and then they back down again. It's like, the two superpowers sized each other up. They're still there, and they backed down and nobody went nuclear. If all of our deadly weapons of mass destruction are out there, 9, 10, 11 different nation states, and maybe terrorist organizations all have them, that's a politically volatile, unstable situation. I got worried. But part of that is because I wasn't thinking about chemical weapons. A coral snake is protected no matter what, and nothing messes with a coral snake ever. So there's a weapon that's cheap, and it still works as a deterrent. And that kind of gives me hope that maybe the political scenario that we're facing isn't quite as scary as I thought it was. And in order to really grasp that, I'd have to really think about chemical weapons. So I know I got carried away again there, but it was a great question.
All right. Our next question is, how do the beetles or insects decide when one wins or loses a duel? Is it simply who gets pushed out of the tunnel or off the branch, or do they often back off when they realize their weapons are smaller than their opponents?
All right, another awesome question. Okay, I will try not to get, are we okay on time, by the way? Is this all right that I'm just going off on these things?
Yes, we're fine.
Okay,
But
then I want to dig
10 or 15 more minutes, yeah.
Okay, cool. So that's part of what makes duels really special, is that the males can escalate sort of slowly in stages. If you've ever watched deer or elk or moose, they don't just go all in. They walk side by side, they look at each other, they bob their heads. They're literally looking at the weapons and sizing each other up. And again, one of the problems we ran into early on in animal behavior is if you want to study fights and you're out there with your clipboard and you're watching all your caribou population or your fallow deer population, you're going to score fights, when they're really knocked down, drag out fighting. And when people did that, they're like, God, the ones with the big weapons, they're not really winning that much of the time. But they were missing 90% of the interactions because most of the biological confrontations never got that far. The males will walk by, look at each other, size each other up, and walk away. So right there, a male has already sized himself up against an opponent, figured out that the other guy's got bigger weapons and is going to win, and made the decision to walk away. That's an encounter. That is an agonistic interaction that actually matters But because we didn't know to look for that for years, those were, they were thrown out. It's like, oh, they didn't fight, not counting that one. They didn't get included in the data set. Now that we know that all of those social interactions really are meaningful biological interactions, we get a much clearer picture. And we find that the males size each other up a lot. So if they're really different in size, they don't even have to touch each other. One of them just walks away. If they're a little bit closer in size, then often they sort of push a little bit. They're sensing how strong am I compared to how strong is this individual. They're sizing each other up. If the male perceives that he's nowhere near as strong as the other one, he walks away. And then if, well, I'm still in this one, then they start twisting and pushing harder. It ramps up to the next level. But there again, you're getting information. So these males are accumulating information during the stages of these interactions. And as soon as they have enough information to decide that they're not likely to win, they walk away. So the simple version is they use all kinds of cues to determine whether they're likely to win. And they only actually escalate a fight if they're pretty evenly matched and they really might win. And that's what led to this initial paradox that when you study the actual fights, yeah, it's kind of 50-50 who wins. It's because those are the animals that have already figured out that they're really evenly matched. And those are the ones that actually escalate. But when you get into the weeds, it's like, what cues did they use? Is the male actually assessing himself? Am I saying, God, how much energy reserve do I have? How much damage am I taking? And making an internal assessment based on how he is doing himself? Or is he aware, self-aware of how competitive he is and comparing that as a metric against an opponent? Looking at the details of how individuals assess each other during contests, that's rich and fun and wild. There's a lot of theory on it, whether they're assessing how they're doing it. There's interesting mathematical models that play it out. And then there's a bunch of people trying to tease them apart. It's tricky because the predictions for a lot of the competing models are very similar. So it takes very careful observations to figure out how to tease them apart. It's one of the things one of my grad students is trying to do is figure out for his stick insects, how is the male deciding to back down? But the quick answer is they always do decide. They figure it out and they do back down. And that's what's missing in a scramble. One more thing. If you're focusing on one individual and then you get struck from the side because somebody comes in from the side, you haven't assessed that individual. You don't know where they're coming from. And then if there's 5 individuals in there, you start getting coalitions and chaos. And so this kind of predictable assessment, oh, he's going to win, I better step aside, only works with a duel. If you're dealing with a scramble, hey, anything goes, man. If the biggest one is competing with that one and they're the 2 biggest, then I can sneak in from the side. Even poor quality animals continue to escalate in a scramble because everything's on the table. Did I lose everybody with that? Hey, can I just make a plug? I know it's tacky, but I know you're probably all thinking about colleges and stuff. If you ever want to learn more about Montana, let me know. We have a fantastic honors college here that really supports a lot of our best and brightest students with international travel scholarships. I mean, amazing stuff. And they made it's kind of silly to share this, but I'm going to anyway. They're starting to do a series of promotional videos that sort of tell the backstories of some of their faculty and why they love Montana and why they're here and a little bit about what makes them tick. And they just did one on me. Took 7 months working with a young videographer from China who is brilliant. And we had a really good time. Anyway, they just released it last week. It's only just out there. But if you wanted to learn a little bit more about me and Montana, it's a good laugh. It's worth watching. So I'm sending you the link. So
I think we have a few more questions, and I'm sure you can find Dr. Emlen's email on his lab website at the University of Montana as well.
I'll put it in here just so you have it. But yes, fire away.
Yep. Do we have more questions, guys? Do you want to give us an idea?
If not, I want to throw some questions at you, but go ahead.
A lot of these like last year, like from our own team, because we've already looked at like almost all the questions. But if anyone like wants to give a question that
I want to ask you one first then while we got a minute. 2, first of all. First one is, did the delivery, that whole idea of sort of pre-assembling it as a YouTube video, My wife thinks that's crazy because you can stream anything on YouTube anyway. Why would you want to tune into a seminar to do the same thing again? But the students in my class this spring flipped and had the opposite opinion. They loved it. It was much more engaging being able to see the little mini me in addition to just looking at the slides and hearing the voice. I'm curious because this is all experimental. It's the first time I've tried doing this. It's just I only made that a couple of weeks ago. Does that work? Would you have preferred that I'd set up and tried to set my notes up and give you the talk live, or was it better to have it pre-assembled?
If you guys would like to unmute and respond, please do.
I really like that it was pre-assembled. I thought it was really helpful to be able to interact with you in the chat during the lecture and ask questions as we thought of them. And I also like that we could also see you in the bottom part of the screen.
Gesticulating like I do. Thanks, Noel.
Do you make those available to your students afterwards as well?
Well, I mean, this is a sort of my research talk, but the lectures for my class, yes. Just in case, I mean, it's a 200 student class. It's one of the huge core classes that it's one of the things I'm very proud of is that we want all of the bio majors and all the wildlife biology majors and all the pre-vet, pre-health people taking evolutionary biology. We think it's one of the absolutely fundamental aspects of understanding the natural world. So it's one of our bigger classes. And having that many students during a pandemic when everybody's dialed in, dialed out is tricky. So I made them all come in live. So, they all had to be there. I took attendance at the Zoom. They had to be there live. I would play it, run the chat. But then as soon as it was done, I would post it in the class shell, the Moodle shell, and they had access to it. They could watch it as many times as they want. They could speed it up. They were all captioned. And then we had discussion sections that met. Some of them were face-to-face and some of them were on Zoom for students that were dispersed. But it was crazy. I mean, I'm sure you've all run into this. There were some aspects of delivering content that were actually improved by this. And in particular, Montana has a lot of very rural areas, and a lot of us learned how to share content with small classrooms in dispersed parts of the state in ways that we never would have before. But on the other hand, people got so sick of Zoom. I mean, eyes glaze over. Once you start checking your email, it's over, man. It's like they might still be there talking, but you're not engaged anymore. That was so easy to happen, that it happened for faculty, it happened for students. We all struggled. We found that there's a fraction of the students, about a half, that loved it, that really did well. It fit with their schedule. They were disciplined enough to stay on target, stay up on assignments. And for them, they didn't have to go anywhere. They could work out of their house. They loved it. And then there was a fraction of the students that was like a train wreck. It's like they just could not stay focused. They started getting a little bit behind and then more behind and then more behind, and it snowballed. And we tried to intervene with advisors. We had all kinds of ways of trying to reach out and catch students and pull them back from the brink. But the simple fact is, not just here at UM, but I think nationally, a significant fraction of students really struggled. And it's tough. This was a year that's a catalyst for us in lots of ways. And I hate to say it to all of you, I've been lecturing about pandemics like this for 20 years. It's going to happen again. This was a dry run. And as bad as we think this was, not that many people died. I mean, I don't want to be callous, but as many as 100 million people died in the 1918 pandemic. And there's just no way to compare that. At the moment, the estimates of the death toll for this pandemic, even accounting for the under records and under recording in certain parts of the world right now, it's about 1 out of every 2,000 people on the planet. And in 1918, it was 1 out of 18 people died. So the potential impact of pandemics can be staggering. This was a really good wake-up call. I think this helped societies figure out what they got right and what they really sucked at and start learning. And the scientists just gobbled it up. I mean, we've got tons of data now, county by county, school district by school district, which intervention methods worked, which ones went too far, which ones didn't. I think the next time this happens, we'll be ready. We'll be able to do a lot better flipping, and we'll be able to flip to remote in a much more strategic way. But it is going to happen again. I guarantee it, probably within the next decade. And actually, if any of you are interested, I recorded a lecture on a comparison between COVID-19 and the 1918 pandemic that, again, if you want it, Susan, you can ask me afterwards. I'll send you the link. Anybody who wants to see it can see it. But it's a pretty shocking parallel.
Yes, absolutely. I think we all should see that. And another good reason to understand molecular biology and
Yes.
biochemistry, just broadly and in detail. Anyone else want to offer a comment about the video format? Because we're going to wrap up pretty soon here.
Or anything.
I actually had a comment. Like, I just thought it was pretty interesting that a lot of like military weapons are actually named after like animals. So maybe there's like an interesting parallel in there. Like, especially like fighter jets, like you name them after like falcons or like hawks.
Interesting. You know what? I've spent all this time reading that. I never made that connection until you brought it up right now. But I will tell you, I showed you that picture of me on the orange background. I was terrified. I was so thrilled that they asked me to come give the sort of fun keynote talk at the end of this 3-day conference on cybersecurity. It's like, yes, I gotta go. My wife's like, you don't have time to do this. Why are you doing this? It's like, are you kidding? I have to go do this. I was so scared. I tripped over the cords on my way up to the podium. The former director of the CIA and the NSA was there. The heads, I mean, all these big corporate people were there and the military people were there. And I'm talking about dung beetles for crying out loud and crap. But you know what? They loved it. I mean, I don't think any of them thought I was like changing the face of national security or anything. None of them took it that seriously, but not very few of them had ever thought about the parallels. And yet most of them loved animals in one way or another. They'd either been raised on farms or they were hunters or they were naturalists. But it was astonishing to me how many people in that national security, intelligence, military, and tech crowd had sort of closet passions that were tied to animals in ways that allowed them to really quickly see the parallels. So maybe that's why they named all the weapons after animals too, is because the people, I don't know. Anyway, it was surprising to me how open and receptive they were to some of this stuff, because man, I was scared.
I think on that note, we can close out. And I wanted to thank the teams who did the introduction and ran the Q&A. This was not only fascinating, but a great conversation and a great way to think about our world moving forward. And so thank you, Dr. Emlen, for enlightening us. I still have hope in world peace, but it might just be putting some frozen peas in a blender.
No, I'm more optimistic than that. I think there's a lot of very well-intentioned people working really hard to make a better future, and you guys have a chance to be part of that. Susan, if I share the link with you by email to this other lecture, can you get it to people, or do you want me to try to
Absolutely.
find it in the chat?
Yeah, I will. I will definitely get it out to everyone.
All right, I'll send you that as soon as we're done.
Wonderful.
Thank you for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the stuff that you're doing there.
Thank you so much. This was a real treat. All right, everyone, this closes out our campus block, and we'll see you all tomorrow back here. Same time, same Zoom channel.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Okay, that was great. Bye-bye.